It was the kind of day that made a man question everything. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the barren fields. Dust swirled in the dry air, and the distant hills seemed to mock the rancher's dwindling hopes. He had put everything into this land, the sweat, the years, the sacrifices, and now it seemed to be slipping through his fingers like sand. Nothing was working. The cattle weren't thriving. The crops barely sprouted. Bills were piling up, and every step forward seemed to be met with another setback. He had worked hard his whole life, but now the dream was fading. His ranch wasn't just a piece of land, it was his legacy. His father had worked it before him, and his grandfather before that. It was a place of pride, a place that had been passed down through generations. But now, standing at the edge of his property, looking out at the fields that once flourished, he couldn't shake the feeling that it was all slipping away. It seemed like the end, and maybe it was. The idea of selling the land and moving on gnawed at him, but the thought of walking away from everything he had known, everything that had been his family's, was almost too much to bear. The burden was heavy, and he wasn't sure how much longer he could carry it. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, he walked slowly back toward the barn. His boots kicked up the dust, and every step seemed to echo the weight of his decision. But just as he reached the barn, something caught his eye: his horse. The old mare was standing at the far end of the corral, her head turned toward him, her ears flicking back and forth as if she was trying to tell him something. For a moment, he stood still, watching her. It was a strange sight. She wasn't acting like herself. There was a tension in the way she stood, a sense of urgency in her posture that he hadn't seen in her before. Curiosity stirred within him, and without thinking, he walked toward her. The mare didn't move, but her eyes followed him closely, and she nickered softly as if waiting for him to approach. He'd known her for years, long enough to know when something was wrong, and this was different. She wasn't just a horse, she was his companion, his friend through the loneliest of days. She had always been there for him when the world seemed to be against him, and now, it felt as though she was trying to tell him something. He reached the corral and stopped a few feet away, watching the mare intently. She didn't approach him, but she tossed her head toward the gate, and for a second, it was almost as if she was pointing in a direction. The rancher frowned. What could she possibly be trying to say? He had no idea, but there was something in her eyes that made him hesitate. The horse was calm, but there was a sense of urgency, something almost pleading in the way she stood there, her gaze locked onto his. For a moment, he considered turning back. Maybe it was just his imagination, a desperate hope that somehow, things would turn around. But he couldn't ignore the feeling creeping up on him, the same feeling that had led him through years of hard work and endless nights. He trusted his instincts, and right now, they were telling him to follow her. The rancher opened the corral gate and stepped inside. The mare didn't flinch, didn't move an inch, but instead she took a step toward him. Her eyes never left his, and without a word, she started walking toward the far end of the property. She wasn't galloping, but her pace was purposeful, steady. The rancher hesitated for only a second before following her. The land was quiet, too quiet. The usual sounds of birds chirping, the rustling of leaves in the wind, were all absent. It was as if the world had fallen silent, watching this strange moment unfold. The rancher's heart beat faster with each step. What was she leading him to? What could she possibly know that he didn't? As they made their way across the barren fields, the rancher couldn't help but feel a strange sense of unease. It was as if the world had shifted, as if the very air around him had changed. The mare was unwavering, her focus never straying from the path ahead. The rancher, despite his doubts, followed closely behind. They came to a stop at the edge of the property, where the land dropped off into a dense, overgrown thicket. The rancher had never ventured this far before. It was rough terrain, difficult to navigate, and the kind of place he would normally avoid. But now, something drew him forward. His horse, standing at the edge of the thicket, looked back at him, as though waiting for him to make the next move. Her eyes were wide and intense, urging him onward. The rancher swallowed hard. What could be waiting for him in that dark, tangled mess of brush and trees? He had no idea, but something told him that it was important, that this wasn't just a random walk. There was something here, a secret, a discovery that could change everything. Or maybe, it would lead him to the very thing that would finally break him. With one last look at his horse, he stepped forward into the thicket. The air was thick with tension, and every step felt like a step into the unknown. The further he went, the denser the underbrush became. It scratched at his skin, and the sound of his footsteps was muffled by the heavy air around him. But the mare led the way, never faltering, never turning back. Then, just as he thought he couldn't go any further, she stopped. The rancher's heart skipped a beat as he looked ahead. What he saw was something he could never have imagined. Something so unexpected, so surreal, that he had to blink twice to make sure his eyes weren't deceiving him. But before he could take another step closer, something rustled in the underbrush, a sound too close for comfort. The mare tensed, her ears flicking in every direction, and for the first time, the rancher felt a chill run down his spine. Something wasn't right. And just as he was about to turn and leave, something stepped out from the shadows, something that would change everything. What was it? What had his horse led him to? Would this discovery be his salvation, or would it push him even further into despair? The answers were just within reach, but the danger was growing, and he was standing on the edge of something far more mysterious and dangerous than he could ever have expected. And the worst part? He had no idea what was going to happen next. The rustling in the underbrush grew louder, snapping the rancher out of his trance. His heart raced, and a cold sweat dripped down his neck. The mare had gone still, her head turned in the direction of the sound, her eyes wide, unblinking. The rancher, instinctively tightening his grip on the reins, felt an uneasy thrill of fear crawling up his spine. The sound continued, though it wasn't the kind of noise one might expect from a wild animal. No, this was something different, something deliberate, almost calculated. The rancher stood motionless, trying to steady his breath. He could feel the tension in the air, thick and heavy like a storm waiting to break. Every instinct he had told him to turn back, to leave this place and never come back. But his feet stayed rooted to the ground, as though the land itself was holding him there. And then it happened. A figure emerged from the shadows, stepping into the narrow path between the trees. At first, it was just a silhouette, tall and lean, moving slowly and deliberately. The rancher's breath caught in his throat. He could make out only the barest details: a wide-brimmed hat, a cloak that fluttered in the wind, and eyes that gleamed like pale moons. For a moment, the world seemed to freeze, the only sound the beating of his own heart. "Easy, boy," the rancher murmured under his breath, trying to reassure the mare, though his voice was laced with uncertainty. The mare, however, didn't move. She stood rooted to the spot, her gaze fixed on the newcomer. The rancher took a cautious step forward, his boots scraping softly against the forest floor. His mind raced, trying to process what he was seeing, but no explanation seemed to fit. Who was this person? What did they want? The figure in the shadows shifted, raising a hand slowly in greeting. The rancher's mind whirled with questions. Had he heard stories about strangers in these woods? Yes. People spoke in whispers of odd figures, people who appeared when least expected, bringing with them cryptic messages or strange warnings. But those were just stories, right? Not many people come this far, the figure said, their voice deep and raspy, as though they hadn't spoken in a long time. You're brave, or maybe just foolish. The rancher took another cautious step, his voice barely above a whisper. What do you want? The stranger's lips curled into a small, enigmatic smile. What do you think I want? They tilted their head, as if the answer was obvious. But to the rancher it wasn't. Nothing about this moment felt obvious. It felt like he had walked into a scene from a dream, a scene that didn't make sense, yet felt strangely familiar, as though he had been here before, long ago. The mare pawed at the ground nervously, breaking the silence. The rancher reached out to calm her, but his eyes never left the stranger. "I don't know who you are, but I don't have time for games," he said, his voice firm now. The stranger's eyes flashed in the dim light. There was something strange about them, something unsettling. They weren't just eyes, they seemed to glow faintly, as though they held secrets no one was meant to see. "Games? I'm not here to play," the stranger said softly. "I'm here to show you something." The rancher's brow furrowed. "Show me what?" The figure didn't answer immediately. Instead, they turned and began walking slowly toward the thicket. The rancher hesitated, unsure of whether to follow. His instincts screamed at him to turn back, to leave this place before things got even stranger. But something about the stranger, the way they moved, the way they seemed to know things without speaking them, kept him rooted to the spot. "Follow me," the stranger called over their shoulder, their voice barely audible above the wind. "The answers you seek are waiting." For a long moment, the rancher stood still, battling with himself. Should he trust this person? Should he follow them into the unknown, into the thick woods where everything felt off kilter, where even the earth seemed to tremble with uncertainty? The mare, however, seemed to make up his mind for him. She shifted nervously, snorting and stamping the ground, clearly uneasy. She was just as confused, just as wary. But then, something unexpected happened. The mare took a step forward, nudging the rancher's arm with her muzzle, as though urging him to follow. The rancher hesitated one last time, then, with a deep breath, made up his mind. "All right. Let's see where this goes," he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. He followed the stranger through the woods, the trees closing in around them, the path growing narrower with every step. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of damp earth and the faintest trace of something else, something metallic, like the air before a storm. He could feel his pulse quicken, and though he tried to dismiss it, a gnawing sense of dread began to creep up his spine. The mare walked beside him, her steps steady, as though she knew exactly where she was going. The rancher watched her closely, trying to decipher the message she was sending him. He had always trusted her instincts before she was a horse, yes, but she had a way of sensing things, of understanding the world around her in a way that was almost otherworldly. Maybe she knew more than he did about what was happening here. As they pressed deeper into the woods, the stranger didn't speak again. Their steps were silent, ghost-like, as if they were one with the shadows. The rancher couldn't help but feel that they were being led somewhere. Somewhere they weren't meant to go. The feeling grew stronger with each passing moment, like a warning bell ringing in his ears. They reached a small clearing, barely big enough for the three of them to stand in. In the center of the clearing was a large stone, weathered by time and covered in moss. The stranger stopped in front of it, turning to face the rancher. "This is it," the stranger said softly. "This is what I wanted to show you." The rancher's gaze dropped to the stone. At first, it seemed like just another oddity in the woods, just another part of the strange landscape. But then he saw its strange markings, carved deep into the surface of the stone. Symbols, unfamiliar and ancient, that seemed to pulse with an eerie energy. His breath caught in his throat. He had seen these symbols before. Not in person, but in books, in stories passed down through the generations, stories about the hidden places in the world, places where the earth itself carried ancient secrets. Places where reality bent, and the laws of nature didn't quite apply. But no one had ever said these places were real. No one had ever said they existed. The rancher took a step forward, drawn to the stone, unable to look away. His fingers hovered just above the symbols, trembling slightly as he felt a strange warmth emanating from them. It was as if the stone itself was alive, waiting for him to unlock its secrets. "This is why I brought you here," the stranger said, their voice now barely a whisper. "The answers are here. The future of your land and maybe even your family's legacy. But unlocking them will come at a price." The rancher's heart raced. What did that mean? What price was the stranger talking about? Before he could ask, the air around them seemed to shimmer, and the ground beneath his feet felt like it was shifting. A distant, unearthly sound echoed through the woods, a sound so faint, so low, it was almost imperceptible. The mare snorted again, her eyes wide and wild, as though she could sense what was coming next. The rancher's pulse quickened. Was this the moment? Was this the thing he had been waiting for, or had he just stumbled into something far darker than he could ever have imagined? The stone pulsed once more, and then, without warning, the ground trembled beneath their feet. The mare whinnied in panic, and the stranger stepped back, their eyes flashing with a strange intensity. The air crackled with energy, and then darkness. The darkness didn't come all at once. It started as a flicker, a slight shift in the air, like the moment before a storm breaks. The rancher's heart thudded in his chest, and he took a step back, instinctively reaching for his horse. The mare had her head turned, ears flat against her skull, her body trembling with nervous energy. The low hum of the air grew louder, vibrating in his bones. The stone beneath his feet seemed to pulse with an energy he couldn't understand, an energy that felt ancient and dangerous. The stranger, standing just a few feet away, remained calm, almost unnervingly so. Their eyes locked onto the stone, unblinking, as if they were waiting for something, or perhaps, they knew exactly what was coming. The rancher's mind raced. This couldn't be happening. This wasn't real. There had to be some logical explanation for everything. The symbols, the stone, the eerie figure in the woods. It was all too much. Too strange. The mare whinnied again, louder this time, as if sensing a threat they couldn't see. The rancher reached for the reins, his fingers tight around them, but even that small action felt powerless in the face of the growing tension. Something was wrong, horribly wrong. And then, a flash. A streak of light, brighter than anything the rancher had ever seen, shot up from the stone, illuminating the entire clearing. The rancher threw his arm up instinctively, shielding his eyes from the intensity. When he lowered it, he saw that the stone had changed. The markings were glowing, pulsing with an unnatural light, and the very air seemed to crackle around them, thick with a sense of foreboding. The stranger didn't flinch. In fact, they seemed to be smiling. A small, knowing grin curled at the corners of their lips. It was as if they had been waiting for this moment all along. And that thought, the idea that they had orchestrated this, somehow sent a chill down the rancher's spine. Was he the one being led here, or was he simply a pawn in someone else's game? Do you understand now? The stranger's voice was barely a whisper, but it cut through the air like a knife. The rancher didn't know how to respond. What was there to understand? The world was changing around him, and all he could do was stand there, caught between the shadows and the light. The mare snorted, her hooves scraping the earth nervously. Her unease was palpable, and it only made the rancher's anxiety worse. Suddenly, there was a low rumble. It wasn't thunder, it was something deeper, something from the earth itself. The ground beneath them trembled again, but this time, it wasn't just a slight quiver. The earth seemed to be groaning, shifting, pulling away from something below. The rancher's breath hitched. Was it an earthquake? Or was something else awakening beneath them? The stranger stepped closer to the stone, and the rancher instinctively stepped back, his mind racing with thoughts of escape. But there was nowhere to run. The thicket surrounding them was dense, the trees closing in on all sides. And the stone, its light was blinding now, making everything else fade into the background. The rancher's eyes darted around, trying to make sense of what was happening, but it was all a blur, a whirlwind of chaos. The figure raised a hand toward the sky, their fingers curling as if grasping for something unseen. And in that moment, the rancher knew something terrible was about to happen. He could feel it in his bones. The air grew colder, heavier, as though the very fabric of reality was starting to tear at the seams. Then, out of the darkness, came a sound. It was distant at first, a faint echo, but it grew louder with each passing second, until it felt like the very earth was shaking beneath them. It was a low, guttural sound, like the growl of a massive creature. The mare's eyes went wide with terror, her body quivering with raw fear. The rancher's own heart pounded in his chest, the sound deafening in his ears. The stranger turned to him, their eyes filled with something far darker than he had seen before. "It's too late to turn back now," they said, their voice colder than the wind rustling through the trees. "The path has already been set." And then, before the rancher could protest, the ground split open. The earth cracked with a deafening sound, like a giant being wrenched apart. The rancher stumbled back, nearly falling as the stone trembled violently beneath him. The mare bolted, her hooves thundering against the ground as she fled in panic, but the rancher couldn't bring himself to move. His legs felt like stone, frozen in place. All he could do was watch as the earth itself seemed to give way. From the deep fissure, something emerged. It was hard to make out at first, a shape too vast and monstrous to comprehend. But as it rose from the earth, the rancher saw it tall, dark, and covered in scales that shimmered in the light. It was like nothing he had ever seen. Its eyes glowed, like twin embers burning with an ancient fire. Its wings vast and leathery unfurled with a deafening roar, sending gusts of wind that knocked the rancher off his feet. The mare, in her desperation, ran straight toward the trees, disappearing into the thick underbrush. The rancher was left lying on the ground, his heart hammering in his chest, struggling to catch his breath as the creature loomed above him. It wasn't just any beast. It was something older. Something connected to the stone, to the symbols, to whatever it was that had led him here. And yet, the strangers stood unmoving, as if they had expected this. "Do you see it now?" the stranger said, their voice almost lost in the sound of the creature's growl. "This is why you came. This is the legacy of your family's land, the power that has been buried for centuries, waiting for the right moment to rise." The rancher's mind spun. Legacy? Power? This thing? None of it made sense. This couldn't be happening. But the creature's eyes never left him, as though it knew him, recognized him, waiting for something. The rancher's pulse quickened, his breath shallow as the reality of the situation began to settle in. This was no mere animal, no simple threat to his land. This was something far worse. This was a force tied to his bloodline, to the land he had worked all his life. This was his legacy, and it wasn't the legacy he had ever imagined. The ground continued to rumble beneath him as the creature stepped forward, each movement sending waves of pressure through the air. The rancher could feel the energy swirling around them, drawing closer, building with every second. The creature's gaze never wavered. It was as if it was waiting for him to make a choice he didn't understand, but one that felt as inevitable as the rising tide. But before he could even process what was happening, the earth beneath him trembled again, and the creature let out a roar that shook the very sky. And in that moment, the rancher realized there was no escaping this. He had crossed a line. He had opened something that couldn't be closed. The mystery had only just begun. And it was far more dangerous than he could have ever imagined. The creature's roar echoed through the trees, sending a shiver through the rancher's body. It wasn't just a sound, it was a presence, a force that seemed to tear through the air itself, vibrating deep within his bones. His legs felt weak, as if the ground beneath him was pulling him down, dragging him toward the gaping fissure that had opened before him. The creature stood, its massive wings unfurling slowly, casting a shadow over the clearing. Its eyes glowed with an intense, unholy light, locking onto the rancher like a predator marking its prey. The stranger had not moved. They were still standing near the stone, watching the creature, as if this was all part of some grand plan. The rancher's gaze flicked to them, a question rising in his chest. What had they brought him to? What was happening? But before he could open his mouth to speak, the air around him seemed to hum with energy, and the ground beneath his feet gave another tremor. The creature's gaze never left him, and with a slow, deliberate motion, it took a step forward, its claws scraping against the earth, sending clouds of dust into the air. The rancher's heart raced as he scrambled backward, his instincts kicking in. He didn't know what to do. There was no running. No escaping. The forest was too dense, the creature too close. His only option was to stay on his feet, to face whatever was coming, no matter how impossible that seemed. The mare's hooves faded into the distance as she bolted, her shrill cry echoing through the trees. The rancher couldn't even bring himself to look back at her. He knew she was gone, and in that moment, it felt like he was alone in a world that had gone mad. The land, once familiar and comforting, was now a trap, a cage built with forces he could barely comprehend. The strangers stepped forward, their eyes still fixed on the creature. "You've opened it now," they said quietly, as though speaking to themselves more than to Rancher. "You've awakened it, and there's no turning back. The land has chosen." The rancher's breath hitched. The land? What did that mean? What had he done? He had come here hoping for answers, thinking he might find a way to save his farm, his life. But now, the very earth itself seemed to have a mind of its own, pulling him into something far deeper than he had ever expected. He tried to steady himself, but his legs felt weak, as if he were sinking into the soil, the weight of the situation bearing down on him. The creature took another step forward, its movements slow and calculated. It sniffed the air, its massive nostrils flaring, as if it were trying to determine something about him. The rancher felt a chill crawl up his spine, and he found himself unable to move. He could hear his own breathing, shallow and rapid, but everything else had fallen silent. The wind had stopped. The trees no longer whispered. The only sound was the soft, rhythmic thudding of his heart, growing louder with every passing second. "Why?" he finally managed to rasp, his voice barely a whisper. "Why me? What do you want from me?" The stranger's gaze shifted to him then, their eyes dark and unreadable. For a moment, it felt like the entire world held its breath. The creature's eyes flicked toward the rancher, as though waiting for something, its muscles rippling beneath its scales. The rancher's gut twisted with a sense of foreboding. The land had chosen. But for what? He was just a rancher. He had no power. No connection to whatever dark force had awakened in the woods. "The land chooses its guardians," the stranger said, their voice low and almost pitying. "And it has chosen you." The words hit him like a punch to the stomach. Guardian? He wasn't some ancient warrior, some protector of sacred lands. He was a farmer. A simple man who had only ever wanted peace. What was this madness? What did they mean, "the land has chosen"? A surge of frustration bubbled up inside him, but before he could voice his anger, the ground rumbled again, louder this time, shaking the very air. The creature's eyes glowed brighter, and it reared back, its wings beating the air with a force that sent a gust of wind crashing into the rancher's chest. He stumbled, gasping for breath, his heart pounding in his ears. The stranger didn't seem fazed by the chaos unfolding around them. Instead, they stepped forward again, standing between the rancher and the creature, their back to the beast. "It's coming," they said softly. "The ritual begins now." The rancher stared at them in confusion. Ritual? What ritual? He had no idea what the stranger was talking about. He only knew that every moment felt more and more out of control, and the danger around him was rising with every passing second. The creature's growl grew louder, vibrating through the air, and the earth trembled again. This time, it wasn't just a tremor, the ground seemed to split further apart, cracks spreading like veins beneath their feet. The rancher's gaze flicked down at the earth, watching in horror as the ground broke open once more, revealing a dark chasm beneath them. From the depths of the chasm, a red light began to glow, faint at first, but growing brighter with each heartbeat. The rancher's pulse quickened. The creature's eyes locked onto the light, its body tensing in anticipation. The stranger, still standing unmoved, raised their hands slowly, as though they were conducting some invisible orchestra. The air hummed with power, and the rancher could feel the electricity in the atmosphere, the tension building like a storm just waiting to break. The creature let out a deafening screech, its wings spread wide as it reared back, its body glowing with the same red light now emanating from the chasm. The rancher instinctively took a step back, but the stranger held up a hand, stopping him in his tracks. "Do not move," the stranger said, their voice commanding yet oddly calm. "This is the moment. The ritual cannot be interrupted." The ground continued to shake, and the red light grew blinding, pulsing with an intensity that made the rancher's vision blur. His head swam, and his legs felt like they would give out beneath him. He had no idea what was happening, but he knew it was something far beyond him, something that had been set into motion long before he had ever stepped into this cursed forest. He wanted to scream, to fight back, but there was no way. He was trapped. The land had chosen him, and now he was nothing more than a spectator in a ritual that he didn't understand. The creature's eyes locked onto him again, its pupils narrowing as it prepared to strike. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the world went still. The creature froze, mid-roar, its massive body suspended in the air. The red light from the chasm stopped pulsing, and the air, thick with tension, seemed to freeze. Everything held its breath. The rancher stood there, eyes wide, heart hammering in his chest. What had just happened? Had the ritual begun? Or had something gone horribly wrong? The silence stretched on, suffocating, as time seemed to slow. The stillness lingered for what felt like an eternity, but every second felt heavier than the last. The creature's immense form hovered, suspended in midair, its glowing eyes locked onto the rancher's, as if it were waiting for something or perhaps, waiting for him. The air was thick with the energy of the moment, a tension that seemed to pulse with the rhythm of his own racing heart. But the silence didn't last. A faint crackling sound broke through the stillness, almost imperceptible at first. The rancher's head snapped to the side, his body tensing as his gaze shifted toward the chasm. At first, he thought it was the sound of the earth settling, of the strange fissures that had opened beneath them. But then, the noise grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't the ground shifting. It was something else. The red light from the chasm flared, intensifying in a burst of fiery brilliance, brighter than the sun. The creature seemed to grow even more agitated, its wings beating the air with increasing fury. Its eyes, once fixed on the rancher, now darted toward the chasm, its body trembling with what could only be described as anticipation or fear. And then, in an instant, the source of the crackling sound revealed itself. From the depths of the chasm, something emerged. It was a figure, but not a human figure. It was tall, shadowy, a silhouette of something ancient and unfathomable. Its body shimmered with an ethereal glow, like the afterimage of a nightmare, barely tangible but powerful enough to make the air shimmer with its presence. The rancher's breath caught in his throat. This wasn't just another force of nature. It was something older, far more dangerous than the creature in front of him. The stranger's face remained neutral, but their eyes flicked toward the figure. The rancher could see something in their gaze, a flicker of fear, or maybe recognition. This new arrival was not just part of the ritual. It was the true source of the power that had been awakened. The land, the stone, the creature everything had been building toward this. Toward the arrival of whatever this thing was. The figure moved with eerie grace, as though it was floating just above the ground, its dark form blending with the shadows of the trees. Its eyes glowed with an unsettling pale light, and the rancher couldn't help but feel a chill run down his spine. This wasn't just a creature of the earth, this was something of the sky, the stars, the very void itself. The air around them seemed to warp, as if the fabric of reality was bending to its will. The creature, once poised to strike, cowered, its wings folding tight against its body as if it were afraid of the figure. The rancher could see the fear in the creature's eyes, the way it recoiled, almost shrinking into itself. "What is that?" the rancher whispered, his voice hoarse, barely audible above the rising tension. The stranger's gaze shifted to him again, their eyes dark and unreadable. The true force. The one who controls everything. The one who has been waiting for this moment. This is not just a ritual, not just a test. This is a battle for dominion. For control of the land, of the power that has been buried for centuries. And now it's your choice. The rancher felt the weight of those words crash down on him. A battle for dominion? What could he possibly have to do with this? He was just a man who had wanted to save his farm, his life, and now he was standing in the middle of something far beyond his understanding. Something far beyond what he had ever imagined. The figure in the chasm stepped forward, its form flickering like a mirage, and as it moved, the ground trembled again, this time with a violent, spine-shaking force. The trees around them groaned, their branches creaking under the strain, as if the earth itself were being torn apart by the mere presence of this being. The rancher staggered back, his legs unsteady, his mind racing. The creature, now almost curled in on itself, let out a low, guttural growl, its eyes narrowed in desperation. The rancher could see that it was preparing for something huge, something that would shift the balance. But before he could even process what was happening, the figure's voice echoed out, low and resonant, as if it were coming from the very heart of the earth itself. "Let the land decide," the figure intoned, its voice carrying a weight that seemed to shake the trees around them. "Let the one who holds the power choose." The rancher's heart pounded in his chest, his throat dry. He had no idea what the figure was talking about. What power? What choice? He was a man with no special gifts, no understanding of ancient forces. Yet, the weight of the moment felt undeniable. The land had chosen him. The stone had chosen him. The creature, this new entity, had chosen him. The figure's eyes turned toward the rancher, and in that instant, he felt a jolt of recognition. This wasn't a battle between creatures, between beasts or gods. It was a battle for his soul. For the very core of who he was, who he could become. His choices, his actions in the next few moments would determine the fate of everything. The land. The creatures. The power that had been hidden away for so long. The stranger stepped closer, their voice barely above a whisper. "You're not just a bystander in this. You never were. You are the key." The rancher's mind reeled, his thoughts spiraling out of control. The land had chosen him? The stranger's cryptic words made sense now. This was never just about his farm. This was about something far older, far more dangerous. The power that had been buried, waiting to awaken, had been tied to him, his bloodline, his very existence. But why? Why him? The creature, once passive, now stood fully upright, its massive wings beating the air with renewed fury. Its eyes never left the rancher, who stood frozen in place, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. Then the figure spoke again, its voice echoing, as if it were speaking both to the rancher and to the land itself. "Choose, mortal," the figure demanded, its tone laced with dark authority. "Will you claim the power of the land as your own? Or will you bow before the one who rules over all?" The rancher's chest tightened as he stared at the glowing creature, then back at the figure before him. The choice was his, but he didn't know what either option would mean. He could feel the ground shifting beneath him, the very air charged with tension. The creature's eyes burned with intensity, the figure's presence suffocating, pulling him toward a decision he wasn't ready to make. Everything was building to this moment. And yet, the rancher stood at the edge, unsure of how to step forward, his body trembling, his mind paralyzed by the enormity of it all. The power was within his reach. But at what cost? The air crackled with tension as the rancher stood frozen in place, every muscle in his body screaming for him to act, but the weight of the choice was too much. He could feel the ground beneath him shifting, the creature's glowing eyes still locked onto him, and the figure in the chasm drawing closer with each heartbeat. The power was overwhelming, pulling at him from every direction. The rancher's mind raced, his thoughts jumbled, but in the depths of his panic, something within him began to stir. It wasn't just fear that held him there. It was the understanding, the sickening realization that this moment was far bigger than him. It always had been. The land, the stone, the creatures, they were all pieces of something ancient and beyond comprehension. But somehow, in the face of this unimaginable power, a small spark of clarity flickered in the rancher's mind. He wasn't here by accident. He hadn't been chosen for nothing. His eyes flicked toward the stranger, who stood like a shadow in front of him, their face still unreadable. "You know what I have to do, don't you?" the rancher asked, his voice shaky but more determined than it had been since the moment this madness had begun. The stranger didn't respond at first, only nodded slowly, their expression tight. Then they stepped back, raising a hand toward the creature and the figure from the chasm. "Then do it," they said quietly. "Claim what is yours. You are the one who has the power to end this." The rancher's heart hammered in his chest. He was the one who could end it. He had no idea what that meant, no idea what would happen when he made the choice. But something deep inside him urged him forward, some primal instinct that told him he was the key. He stepped forward, his hands trembling, and as he did, the ground seemed to shift with him, like the very earth was reacting to his movement. The creature let out a low growl, but it didn't approach. It didn't dare. Its eyes still glowed with an almost pleading desperation, its massive wings twitching nervously. The figure, however, remained still, its gaze fixed on the rancher. The tension in the air was almost unbearable. Without thinking, the rancher stretched out his hand, not toward the creature, not toward the figure, but toward the chasm itself. He could feel the raw power in the land now, coursing through him like an unstoppable current. The moment his hand moved, everything seemed to change. The earth beneath him groaned, the sky darkened as though the sun had been blotted out, and the creature shrieked, its massive form writhing in agony. For a split second, he thought the world was collapsing around him. But then, the pain, the pressure suddenly released. The chasm opened wider, its red light turning into a deep blue, and the earth seemed to settle, as if the land itself had taken a deep breath and exhaled. The creature collapsed to the ground, its eyes wide with shock and pain, as though it had lost something crucial. The figure, too, seemed to falter, its once ethereal form flickering, as though it were beginning to unravel. The rancher stood there, breathless, watching as the forces around him seemed to disintegrate. It was over. The power had shifted. The land had made its choice, and now it was his to command. Or so he thought. Just as he felt the weight of victory beginning to settle on his shoulders, the earth trembled once more, this time with a low, rumbling sound that seemed to come from deep within the earth itself. The rancher's heart skipped a beat. The creature, still lying on the ground, suddenly began to stir, its eyes flashing with a new intensity, an intensity that was not fear, but rage. But it wasn't the creature's movements that caught the rancher's attention. It was the figure. The once shimmering form had collapsed into itself, folding in a way that defied logic. And then, with a sickening crack, it split open like a shell, revealing the truth. The being wasn't a force from the land at all. It was human. The rancher's eyes widened in disbelief. The figure before him wasn't some god or ancient entity. It was a man who now stood, fully revealed. His body dripping with the blue energy that had once powered the chasm. But it wasn't the energy of the land. It was something darker. A twisted version of it. The man's eyes met the rancher's with a cold, calculating gaze, and a smile slowly spread across his face. "Did you think you could just walk away from this?" the man asked, his voice low and malicious. "You've only played into my hands." The rancher felt the world tilt, his stomach turning as he realized the truth. The creature, the stranger, the ritual, it had all been part of the man's plan. From the very beginning, he had orchestrated everything. He had used the rancher as a pawn in a much larger game, manipulating the power of the land to create a weapon, one that would allow him to control everything. The rancher stumbled back, his mind spinning. He had been tricked. All of it, the land choosing him, the strange events that had led him here, it was all part of a much darker design. And now, standing in front of him, the man who had orchestrated it all was about to take control. "I didn't want this," the rancher whispered, his voice shaking. "I never wanted any of this." The man laughed, the sound cold and mocking. "It doesn't matter what you wanted. It's done now. You've sealed your fate. The land is mine." But just as the man reached out, the ground beneath them all began to tremble again, not with the same ominous power, but with something different. The rancher's heart skipped a beat as he realized what was happening. The power that had surged through him, the power he had used to change the course of the land, wasn't just his. It wasn't something that could be controlled by anyone, not even by the man standing before him. It was a force of nature, ancient and unyielding. And now, it was rebelling. The earth cracked open once again, but this time, it wasn't just the chasm that opened. The entire forest seemed to rise up, as though the land itself was rejecting the man's control. The creature, now fully aware of the shift in power, scrambled to its feet, its body glowing with a fierce new energy. It turned its eyes toward the rancher, not with hatred or fear, but with something akin to respect. And then, in a single, explosive moment, everything changed. The rancher felt the power surge within him one last time, but this time, it wasn't just the land's energy. It was something else, a force of balance, of retribution. With one final, desperate movement, he reached out, channeling the energy into the earth. The ground beneath them shattered, and the figure once so certain of his victory was engulfed in the very power he had tried to control. As the man screamed, his form disintegrated, swallowed up by the earth itself. The creature, the land, and the rancher were left standing alone in the shattered landscape. The tension that had gripped them all seemed to vanish, leaving only the lingering echo of the battle that had just unfolded. The rancher's chest heaved with exhaustion, his mind still reeling from what had just happened. He had won. The land was free. But as he stood there, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching him. Something deep in the earth, beneath the forest, in the very heart of the land, waiting for the moment to rise again. The rancher took one last look at the horizon, where the sun was just beginning to rise, casting a new light over the world. He had won, yes. But the land had never truly been his to command. It was only a matter of time before the cycle would begin again. The rancher stood in the aftermath, the ground beneath him still trembling slightly as the last echoes of the battle faded into a quiet, eerie calm. The forest around him seemed to breathe, the trees swaying gently in the morning breeze, the once thick, oppressive air now lighter, freer. Yet, despite the newfound peace, the rancher couldn't shake the sense of unease that clung to him. The battle had been won, but the war was far from over. The land, he realized, would never be fully at rest. Neither would he. For a long time, he stood there, unable to move, watching the dawn break over the horizon. The soft, golden light bathed the wreckage of the chasm, illuminating the remnants of the ancient power that had nearly consumed everything he had ever known. It was hard to believe that just hours ago, everything had felt like it was slipping through his fingers, the weight of the land's terrible secret pressing down on him. But now, in the quiet after the storm, he felt something else, a strange, unfamiliar peace. It wasn't victory, not entirely. It was more like the calm that follows a thunderstorm, when the world is washed clean, but the air still smells of the rain. He glanced back at the creature that had once towered before him, its form now crumpled on the ground. It lay there, not dead, but subdued. The light in its eyes had dimmed, and it no longer seemed like an enemy. The rancher stepped closer, slowly, cautiously, unsure of what to expect. The creature's massive wings fluttered slightly, as if awakening from a deep slumber. The rancher knelt beside it, feeling the weight of the moment pressing on him. The creature's gaze met his, and for the first time, it wasn't full of fear or aggression. It was an understanding. A silent recognition that, perhaps, they weren't so different after all. The rancher placed a hand on its massive, scaled body, feeling the warmth of life beneath his fingertips. "You don't have to fight anymore," he whispered, though he wasn't sure if the creature could even understand. But in that moment, the creature's eyes softened, and for the first time, it seemed almost grateful. It shifted slightly, a soft rumble vibrating through its body, before slowly pushing itself upright. The rancher stepped back, still unsure of its intentions, but the creature didn't attack. Instead, it turned its head to the chasm, where the last traces of the mysterious energy had begun to dissipate, the red glow fading into nothingness. As if on some unspoken cue, the creature spread its wings wide and began to slowly walk toward the edge of the chasm. The rancher watched, his heart heavy with the weight of everything that had transpired. He couldn't deny the connection he felt, the bond forged between them through the shared struggle, the shared survival. But now, it was time for the creature to go. Its purpose here was fulfilled, and the land would heal. The rancher turned away from the creature, knowing deep down that this was the last time he would see it. It wasn't just a battle between them. It had always been about the land, about the forces beyond their control, forces that had been set into motion long before either of them had even been born. And now, it was up to the land to decide what came next. He took a deep breath, filling his lungs with the fresh morning air. There was no more fear now. Only the quiet acceptance of the world as it was. He glanced down at the earth beneath him, his hand brushing over the soil. The land had chosen him, but it had also chosen to let him go. The battle was over, and he had made his peace with that. But as he turned to leave, a distant, haunting thought lingered in the back of his mind. The land might have forgiven him, but would it ever truly be free? The power that had awakened in those dark hours of the night wasn't just gone. It was buried beneath the surface, waiting for the next spark to ignite it. The creature had been only one part of the puzzle, one piece in a much larger, more dangerous game. There were things in this world, things beyond his understanding, that would always be lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to emerge. The rancher's thoughts were interrupted by a soft rustling behind him. He turned, and his heart skipped a beat when he saw the stranger standing there, watching him quietly from the edge of the clearing. The figure, whose true nature had been revealed in the heat of the battle, was no longer an enigma. The rancher could see now that the stranger was no ordinary man. There was something more, someone who had been woven into the fabric of the land itself, a guardian, or perhaps an architect, of its mysteries. "You did it," the stranger said, their voice low but warm, tinged with something like approval. "You made the right choice." The rancher swallowed, still grappling with the enormity of everything that had happened. "But what happens now?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "What do we do? What's next?" The stranger's gaze softened, and they stepped closer, their eyes reflecting the weight of 1,000 unspoken truths. Now you live. You heal. And you remember. The land isn't done with you, not yet. You've done what needed to be done, but the land will always find a way to call on you again. Just as it called on you this time. The rancher shook his head. I don't know if I can go through that again. You won't have to, the stranger said gently. The land will find its own path now. But you've made a difference. A big one. You've given it time to heal. The rancher let the words sink in. For the first time in what felt like forever, he allowed himself to truly believe in the possibility of peace. The battle was over, and he had won. Not in the way he had expected, but in the way that mattered. He had saved the land, not through brute force or power, but through understanding. Through the willingness to stand against the forces that sought to control it, to fight for something greater than himself. As the stranger turned to leave, the rancher stood there for a long while, lost in thought. The sun was fully up now, casting long shadows across the landscape, and the world seemed to be waking up with him. It was a new day, and while the land had been scarred by what had happened, it was still there. It would still endure. And maybe, just maybe, it would never be the same again, but that didn't mean it was broken. It was evolving. He turned back to his farm, his home, and walked slowly toward it. There was work to be done, but for the first time, he felt like he could take it on with a sense of peace. The weight that had borne down on him for so long had lifted, and while he knew that the future was uncertain, he had learned something important. No matter how dark things might seem, there was always hope. There was always a way forward. And as he reached the door to his farmhouse, he paused for a moment, looking out over the land he had fought so hard to protect. It was his now, yes, but it was also something more. It was a living, breathing thing, full of secrets and power and mystery. And as long as he was its caretaker, he would never stop listening to what it had to say. The rancher stepped inside, closing the door behind him, and for the first time in years, he allowed himself to believe that everything might just be okay. That no matter what lay ahead, he had the strength to face it. And as he sat down at the table, staring out the window at the quiet, rolling hills, he finally understood that peace wasn't something that came easily. It was something you fought for, something you earned. And with that thought, he closed his eyes, knowing that whatever came next, he was ready.